How do you handle betrayal when it's delivered with a smile, right in front of your family and colleagues, on the night meant to honor your life's work? At my own retirement dinner after 3 decades on the bench, my daughter-in-law's father tried to humiliate me with a dirty trick. But I saw it coming. What happened in that crowded banquet hall changed the way everyone saw us both, and the way I handled his revenge left a mark that would never fade. The crystal chandeliers of the Grandview Manor cast warm light across the assembled crowd as I, Franklin Everett, stepped into the banquet hall that would serve as the stage for my retirement celebration. After 30 years on the Supreme Court, this evening was meant to be a dignified farewell to a career built on justice and integrity. The applause that greeted me was genuine, warm, and tinged with the respect I had earned through decades of careful deliberation and fair rulings. My wife Judith, elegant in her navy dress, squeezed my arm as we made our way to the head table. At 62, she still carried herself with the poise of the teacher she had been before my career demanded her full attention. Our son Graham followed close behind with his wife Mallory, their 2 young children chattering excitedly about the fancy dinner ahead. It was Mallory who first caught my attention that evening, not for her usual ambitious chatter about Graham's law practice, but for the way she kept glancing toward the far corner of the room where her father, Curtis Noland, held court with a small group of business associates. Curtis, at 64, was a successful real estate developer who had built his fortune through aggressive deals and an even more aggressive personality. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expensive suit immaculate, but there was something in his posture tonight that set off quiet alarm bells in my mind. As a judge, you learn to read people. You develop an instinct for when someone is performing rather than simply being present. Curtis was performing tonight, his laugh too loud, his gestures too broad, his eyes too often finding mine across the room with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "Dad, you remember my father, Curtis Noland," Mallory said as we approached their table. Her tone carried an odd formality, as if she were introducing strangers rather than family members who had shared countless holiday dinners. "Of course," I replied, extending my hand. Curtis's grip was firm, perhaps a touch too firm, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Justice Everett," he said, his voice carrying just enough emphasis on my title to make it sound almost mocking. "What a night this must be for you, the end of an era." There was something in the way he said "end" that made me study his face more carefully. Curtis had always been competitive, the type of man who turned every conversation into a contest he needed to win. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt personal. The cocktail hour proceeded with the usual pleasantries. Colleagues from the court shared stories of landmark cases, law school friends reminisced about our younger days, and family members posed for photos that would commemorate this milestone. Through it all, I found myself increasingly aware of Curtis's presence, the way he seemed to be watching me even when engaged in conversation with others. Dr. Leonard Pace, my old friend and former law school classmate, noticed my distraction. "You seem troubled, Franklin," he observed quietly as we stood near the bar. "This should be a celebration." "Just family dynamics," I replied, not wanting to voice my growing unease. Leonard had been a criminal psychologist before his retirement, and his perceptive nature had always made him an excellent confidant. But tonight, I wasn't ready to articulate the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface of this elegant gathering. It was then that I overheard a fragment of conversation between Curtis and Mallory. They stood near the entrance to the hotel bar, their voices low, but not quite low enough. "Old debts being paid tonight," Curtis was saying, his tone carrying a satisfaction that made my stomach tighten. "Are you sure about this?" Mallory's response was barely audible, but the concern in her voice was unmistakable. "He had it coming for 30 years, Curtis replied. "Sometimes justice needs a little help." The words sent a chill through me, though I maintained my composure as I moved away from their conversation. Justice needs help? What could Curtis possibly mean by that? As I searched my memory for any significant interaction we might have had, a vague recollection began to surface. Something from my early years on the court, a case involving financial impropriety, a defendant whose name I couldn't quite recall. The dinner bell chimed, and we all moved toward our assigned tables. I found myself seated at the head table with Judith on my right, and, to my surprise, Curtis positioned directly across from me. This hadn't been the original seating arrangement. I was certain of that. Someone had made changes. The first course arrived with the usual fanfare of a high-end catering operation. Valeria Russo, the catering manager, personally oversaw the service at our table, her professional demeanor ensuring that every detail was perfect. It was during the soup course that I noticed Curtis's behavior becoming increasingly odd. He seemed nervous, checking his watch repeatedly and fumbling with his napkin. When the servers came to refill our wine glasses, Curtis made an unusual show of reaching across the table, ostensibly to pass the salt to Judith. But his movement brought him directly over my wine glass, and for just a moment, his other hand moved in a way that seemed deliberately concealed from the other diners. Every instinct I had developed over 30 years of observing human behavior told me that Curtis had just done something to my drink. The movement had been too quick, too purposeful, too carefully hidden. I glanced at his face and saw a flash of satisfaction that confirmed my suspicions. My mind raced through possibilities. What could he have put in my glass? A laxative? Something to make me ill? The fragments of conversation I had overheard suddenly took on a sinister meaning. Curtis wanted to humiliate me, to turn my retirement dinner into a spectacle that would overshadow 3 decades of distinguished service. But Curtis had underestimated me. 30 years on the bench teaches you more than just legal precedent. It teaches you how to think quickly under pressure, how to remain calm when others would panic, and how to turn an adversary's strategy against them. I waited for the right moment. When the main course arrived, I made a show of cutting my steak with enthusiasm, deliberately working my fork at an awkward angle. Then, with what appeared to be simple clumsiness, I knocked the fork from my hand. It clattered to the floor with enough noise to draw attention from our immediate neighbors. "Oh, how clumsy of me," I said with an embarrassed laugh, pushing back my chair to retrieve the utensil. As I bent down, I used the distraction to quickly switch my wine glass with Curtis's. The movement was smooth, practiced, and completely unnoticed by anyone at the table. When I straightened up, fork in hand, Curtis was already reaching for his wine glass, the one that now contained whatever he had intended for me. I watched with calm interest as he took a healthy sip, then another, completely unaware that he had just consumed his own trap. The speeches began shortly after. Various colleagues and friends rose to share memories and offer congratulations. Curtis, perhaps emboldened by what he believed was his successful sabotage, stood to offer his own remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "As the father of Justice Everett's daughter-in-law, I've had a unique perspective on his career. Tonight, we celebrate not just his achievements, but the consequences of his decisions." The word consequences hung in the air with an ominous weight. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent of hostility in Curtis's tone. I remained perfectly still, watching his face for the first signs of what was to come. Curtis continued his speech for another minute, his words becoming increasingly pointed as he alluded to justice being served and old wrongs being made right. But then, mid-sentence, his expression changed. A look of confusion crossed his face, followed quickly by obvious discomfort. His hand moved to his stomach, and I saw the first beads of perspiration forming on his forehead. Whatever he had intended to slip into my drink was now working its way through his own system, and from the look of growing panic on his face, it was going to be both immediate and humiliating. Excuse me," Curtis mumbled, his composure cracking as the first wave of intestinal distress hit him. "I need to—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he hurried from the podium with an awkward, bow-legged gait that suggested he was fighting a losing battle with his own digestive system. The murmurs that followed his hasty exit ranged from concern to confusion, but I noticed that several guests were struggling not to laugh at the undignified spectacle. As Curtis disappeared in the direction of the restrooms, I quietly reached for my napkin and used it to carefully wipe the rim of his wine glass, the one that had originally been mine. The residue from whatever he had slipped into my drink would be preserved in the fabric, evidence that might prove useful later. Dr. Pace leaned over and whispered, "Well, that was unexpected. Poor fellow must have eaten something that disagreed with him." "Yes," I replied calmly, folding the napkin and slipping it into my jacket pocket. Sometimes these things have a way of working themselves out. The drive home was unusually quiet. Judith sat beside me in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming lightly against her purse, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years when something was troubling her. In the back seat, Graham and Mallory whispered in hushed tones, their conversation too low for me to hear, but intense enough to suggest they were discussing more than just Curtis's embarrassing exit from the dinner. Once we arrived home, I retreated to my study while Judith went to check on the grandchildren with their babysitter. The room had always been my sanctuary, lined floor to ceiling with legal volumes, case studies, and the accumulated wisdom of 3 decades in jurisprudence. Tonight, however, it would serve a different purpose. I carefully removed the napkin from my jacket pocket and placed it in a clean manila envelope. The fabric had absorbed whatever substance Curtis had intended for me, and I wanted to preserve it exactly as it was. Next, I sat at my desk and began to reconstruct the evening's events in my mind, writing down every detail I could remember about Curtis's behavior, his conversation with Mallory, and the precise moment when he had tampered with my glass. It was during this reflection that the memory I had been struggling to recall finally surfaced with crystal clarity. Curtis Noland, Noland Development Corporation. A case from 1994, early in my tenure on the court, involving fraudulent building permits and bribery of city officials. Curtis had been the primary defendant, a young and arrogant developer who had thought his money and connections would protect him from the consequences of his actions. I pulled out my laptop and accessed the legal database, searching for the case files. There it was, State v. Noland Development Corporation, a relatively minor case in the grand scheme of my career, but one that had clearly left a lasting impression on Curtis. He had been fined $50,000 and received 2 years probation for his role in the permit fraud scheme. A slap on the wrist, really, considering the scope of his violations. But I remembered now how Curtis had reacted to the verdict. While his lawyers had advised him to accept the plea deal and move on, Curtis had stood in my courtroom and glared at me with naked hatred. "This isn't over," he had said, his voice barely controlled. "People like you think you can destroy people like me, but you're wrong. I have a long memory." At the time, I had dismissed it as the empty bluster of a man who had been caught and was looking for someone to blame. Defendants often made threats they never intended to follow through on, but Curtis, it seemed, was different. He had nursed his grudge for 30 years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike back. The sound of voices from the living room drew me from my research. I could hear Graham's measured tones and Mallory's higher, more agitated responses. Their conversation was growing heated, and I caught fragments that suggested they were discussing the evening's events. "Completely embarrassing," Mallory was saying. "Not his fault your father got sick," Graham replied. "Don't you think it's convenient?" I closed my laptop and walked toward the living room, but stopped just outside the doorway when I heard my name mentioned. "Your father has always been jealous of Franklin," Judith was saying, her voice carrying the firmness she had once used to manage unruly students. "This isn't the first time Curtis has made snide comments about the court case." "That case ruined my father's reputation," Mallory shot back. "Do you have any idea what it was like growing up with everyone knowing your father was a criminal?" "Your father was never a criminal," Graham interjected. "He paid a fine and moved on. He built a successful business after that." "But the stigma never went away," Mallory continued, "and tonight, on what should have been a celebration, he gets food poisoning and humiliates himself in front of everyone. It's like Franklin's curse follows our family everywhere." I stepped into the room at that moment, and the conversation stopped abruptly. Mallory's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, while Graham looked uncomfortable at being caught in the middle of a family dispute. "I'm sorry about your father's illness," I said calmly. "I hope he's feeling better." Mallory studied my face closely, as if searching for any hint of deception. "It's strange, don't you think? He was fine all evening, and then suddenly he became severely unwell right in the middle of his speech." "These things happen," I replied. "Perhaps something he ate earlier in the day, or stress from the public speaking. Your father has always been intense about family gatherings." "Intense," Mallory repeated, her tone suggesting she found my word choice inadequate. "My father is passionate about justice, Franklin. He believes in consequences for actions." The way she said consequences echoed her father's speech from earlier, and I realized that whatever Curtis had planned, Mallory had been aware of it. Perhaps not the specific details, but she had known something was going to happen tonight. After Mallory and Graham left to take the children home, Judith and I sat in our family room, the tension of the evening finally beginning to settle. She poured herself a cup of tea and looked at me with the expression I had learned to recognize over 40 years of marriage, the look that said she knew I was holding something back. "What really happened tonight?" she asked quietly. I considered how much to tell her. Judith had always been my closest confidant, the person who helped me process the difficult decisions and ethical dilemmas that came with my position. But this situation was different. This was family, and the implications could tear apart relationships that our grandchildren would have to live with for years to come. "I think Curtis may have tried to play a prank that backfired," I said carefully. "Something to embarrass me during the dinner." "What kind of prank? The kind that might have involved my drink?" Judith's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You think he put something in your wine? Something to make you sick?" "I think it's possible. And I think whatever he used ended up affecting him instead." "How?" I told her about the switched glasses, about Curtis's suspicious behavior, and about the napkin I had preserved as evidence. Judith listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "For now? Nothing. I'm going to wait and see what Curtis does next. If he's smart, he'll let this go and chalk it up to a lesson learned. But if he's as vindictive as I suspect, then what? Then I'll be ready. The next morning brought an unexpected development. As I sat in my study reviewing the previous evening's notes, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Curtis's name, and I debated whether to answer. Curiosity won out. Franklin. Curtis's voice was strained, hoarse, as if he had spent the night in considerable discomfort. We need to talk. Good morning, Curtis. I trust you're feeling better? Don't play games with me. I know what you did. I'm afraid I don't follow. The glasses. You switched them somehow. That was meant for you, not me. The accusation lingered between us, and I felt a grim sense of confirmation. Curtis really had tried to tamper with my food, and now he was furious that his scheme had turned against him. Curtis, I think you may still be feeling the effects of whatever made you ill last night. Perhaps you should rest. Listen to me very carefully, he interrupted, his voice taking on a threatening tone. You poisoned me. You brought something to that dinner specifically to make me sick, and you're going to pay for it. That's a very serious accusation, I replied calmly. I hope you have evidence to support such a claim. I don't need evidence. I know what happened, and so do you. This is just like 30 years ago. You think you can destroy people and walk away without consequences. Curtis, if you're planning to make any formal accusations, I'd suggest you speak with an attorney first. False accusations can have serious legal implications. The line went quiet for a moment, and when Curtis spoke again, his voice was cold with calculation. Oh, I'll be speaking with attorneys, Franklin. Count on it. And when I'm done, everyone will know exactly what kind of man you really are. After he hung up, I sat back in my chair and considered my options. Curtis was clearly planning some kind of retaliation, probably involving public accusations and possibly legal action. The smart thing would be to get ahead of his narrative, to prepare a defense based on facts and evidence rather than emotion and revenge. I opened a new file folder and labeled it Noland Dinner Incident. Inside, I placed the envelope containing the napkin, my notes from the evening, and a printed copy of the original court case from 1994. If Curtis wanted to turn this into a public battle, I would be ready with documentation that would not only clear my name, but expose his true motives for anyone willing to look at the facts. The phone rang again, this time showing Graham's number. Dad, I just got off the phone with Mallory. She says Curtis is talking about filing a police report, claiming you deliberately made him sick at the dinner. Is that what Mallory believes? Graham was quiet for a moment. She's conflicted. She loves her father, but she also knows he can be vindictive. She asked me to call you and see if there was any way to resolve this quietly. What did you tell her? I told her that if her father has evidence of wrongdoing, he should present it to the proper authorities, and if he doesn't have evidence, he should be very careful about making public accusations. That was good advice. Dad, what really happened last night? I considered how much to tell my son. Graham was a good lawyer and a good man, but he was also married to Curtis's daughter. Whatever I told him would likely find its way back to Mallory and through her to Curtis. Your father-in-law tried to humiliate me at my own retirement dinner, I said finally. It didn't work out the way he planned. Did you do something to make him sick? I protected myself from something he tried to do to me. The fact that his own scheme backfired is not my responsibility. Graham sighed heavily. This is going to tear the family apart. Only if Curtis chooses to escalate it. The ball is in his court now. But even as I said the words, I knew Curtis would escalate. Men like him always did. They couldn't accept defeat, couldn't acknowledge that their own actions had consequences. Curtis would double down, make bigger accusations, and try to turn this into a public spectacle that would force everyone to choose sides. I looked at the evidence folder on my desk and felt a familiar calm settle over me. I had spent 30 years dealing with people who thought they could manipulate the system, who believed their wealth or connections or righteous anger gave them the right to destroy others. Curtis Noland was about to learn the same lesson his younger self had learned 3 decades ago. Justice has a way of finding those who try to pervert it. The next few days passed in an uncomfortable quiet that felt more like the calm before a storm than any real peace. Curtis made no public accusations, filed no police reports, and seemed to be regrouping after his failed attempt at revenge. But I knew him well enough by now to recognize that his silence was strategic, not surrender. The first sign of his new approach came through Mallory. She arrived at our house on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to have the children visit their grandparents, but her real purpose became clear when she asked to speak with me privately. We sat in Judith's garden, surrounded by the late roses that had always been my wife's pride. Mallory perched on the edge of her chair, her posture rigid with barely contained emotion. Franklin, I need to ask you something directly, she began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. Did you bring anything to the dinner on Saturday night? Anything that might have made my father sick? No, Mallory. I brought nothing but an appetite and good intentions. Then how do you explain what happened to him? I don't. Sometimes people get sick. It's unfortunate, but it's not necessarily anyone's fault. She studied my face carefully, looking for tells that might betray deception. My father thinks you poisoned him. Your father is wrong. He says you've hated him ever since that court case 30 years ago. I don't hate your father, Mallory. I barely think about him at all, except when family gatherings require it. The bluntness of my response seemed to surprise her. She had probably expected denials or explanations, not the simple truth that Curtis was so insignificant in my life that he rarely occupied my thoughts. That case destroyed his reputation, she said, her voice rising slightly. Do you have any idea what it was like for our family? Your father destroyed his own reputation by breaking the law. The court simply acknowledged what he had already done. You could have been lenient. You could have shown mercy. I showed justice. That's what judges do. Mallory stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. You're so cold, so self-righteous. You sit in your ivory tower and pass judgment on people, but you never have to live with the consequences of your decisions. I live with them every day, I replied calmly. Every decision I made affected real people's lives. I never took that responsibility lightly. Well, now you're going to understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end. My father is going to make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. After she left, I called Dr. Leonard Pace and asked if we could meet for coffee. Leonard had been more than just a law school classmate. His background in criminal psychology had made him an invaluable sounding board over the years when I needed to understand the motivations behind particularly complex cases. We met at a quiet cafe near the university where we had both studied decades earlier. Leonard listened without interruption as I explained the situation, from Curtis's behavior at the dinner to Mallory's visit that afternoon. Classic narcissistic revenge pattern, Leonard observed when I finished. He can't accept that his own actions led to negative consequences, so he's created a narrative where you're the villain who destroyed his life. The dinner was probably meant to be his moment of triumph, his chance to publicly humiliate you the way he feels you humiliated him. And now that it backfired? Now he'll escalate. Men like Curtis don't retreat, they double down. He'll make bigger accusations, try to involve more people, attempt to force a public reckoning where he can play the victim. What would you recommend? Leonard smiled grimly. Document everything. Save every communication, every threat, every accusation. Men like Curtis always overplay their hand eventually, and when they do, you want to be ready with facts instead of emotions. That evening, I expanded my evidence file. I added notes from my conversation with Mallory, a detailed timeline of events from the dinner, and a list of potential witnesses who had observed Curtis's behavior that night. I also began researching the legal implications of his accusations, preparing for the possibility that he might actually follow through on his threats to involve law enforcement. The call I had been expecting came Friday morning. Franklin, this is Curtis. I'm calling to give you one last chance to do the right thing. What exactly do you consider the right thing, Curtis? A public apology, an admission that you deliberately made me sick at your dinner, and compensation for the medical expenses and emotional distress you've caused. And if I refuse? Then I go public. I tell everyone, your former colleagues, the legal community, the press, exactly what you did. I'll file a police report for assault, and I'll sue you for damages. Curtis, I'd strongly advise you to reconsider. False accusations can have serious legal consequences. They're not false, and we both know it. You have 24 hours to decide. After he hung up, I sat in my study and considered my options. Curtis was clearly committed to his course of action, and nothing I said was going to dissuade him. He had convinced himself that I was guilty, and more importantly, he had convinced himself that he could win a public battle based on accusations alone. He was wrong on both counts. I called my attorney, Patricia Westbrook, and scheduled an emergency meeting. Patricia had handled my personal legal matters for 15 years, and she understood both my character and my commitment to ethical behavior. When I explained the situation, her response was immediate and decisive. We need to get ahead of this, she said. If he's going to make public accusations, we need to be prepared with a comprehensive response that includes evidence, witnesses, and documentation. What kind of evidence would be most useful? Anything that proves he tampered with your drink, any witnesses who saw suspicious behavior, any documentation of his threats, or admissions of intent. I handed her the envelope containing the napkin. This should have residue from whatever he put in my glass. I'd like to have it analyzed. Patricia examined the napkin carefully. This is good. We can have it tested for common substances used in pranks, laxatives, diuretics, anything that might cause the symptoms he experienced. If we can prove he brought these substances to the dinner, it supports your version of events. What about witnesses? Anyone who saw him acting suspiciously around your table, anyone who heard him make threats or admissions. The catering staff would be particularly valuable since they're neutral parties. Over the weekend, I began the careful process of building my defense. I contacted Valeria Russo, the catering manager, and explained that there might be questions about the dinner service. She was professional and helpful, confirming that she had noticed Curtis acting strangely around our table and that she would be willing to provide a statement if needed. I also reached out to several guests who had been seated near our table, ostensibly to thank them for attending, but actually to gauge what they had observed. Dr. Pace confirmed that he had noticed Curtis's nervous behavior and his unusual interest in the wine service. 2 other colleagues mentioned that Curtis had seemed agitated during his speech, even before he became ill. By Sunday evening, I had assembled a comprehensive file of evidence and witness statements. Patricia reviewed everything and nodded with satisfaction. "This is solid," she said. "If he follows through on his threats, we can not only defend against his accusations, but potentially file countercharges for harassment and defamation." "I don't want to destroy him," I said. "I just want this to end." "Franklin, men like Curtis don't stop until they're forced to stop. If you show weakness, if you try to accommodate his demands, he'll see it as validation and escalate further. Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to hit back harder than they hit you." That night, as I lay in bed next to Judith, I thought about Patricia's words. I had spent my career trying to find measured, proportional responses to wrongdoing. But Curtis wasn't interested in justice or fairness. He wanted revenge, and he was willing to destroy my reputation to get it. Perhaps it was time to remind him that revenge was a game 2 people could play, and that some people played it much better than others. Monday morning brought the news I had been expecting. Graham called just after breakfast, his voice tight with stress and family loyalty torn in multiple directions. "Dad, Curtis filed a police report this morning. He's accusing you of assault and intentional poisoning." "What exactly did he tell them?" "That you brought some kind of substance to the dinner and secretly added it to his drink to embarrass him in public. He's claiming it was planned payback for the court case." "And what did the police say?" "They're treating it as a complaint for now, not pressing charges immediately, but they want to interview you." "That's fine. I'll call Patricia and we'll arrange something." "Dad." Graham's voice carried a weight of exhaustion. "Mallory is talking about taking the kids and staying with her father for a while. She says she can't have them around someone who might be dangerous." The accusation hit harder than I had expected. The idea that my own daughter-in-law would consider me a threat to my grandchildren was both painful and infuriating. But it also clarified something important. Curtis wasn't just trying to destroy my reputation anymore. He was trying to destroy my family. "Tell Mallory that she needs to do what she thinks is best for the children," I said carefully. "But also tell her that making decisions based on unproven accusations might not be the wisest course." After hanging up with Graham, I called Patricia and briefed her on the police complaint. She was already preparing for this possibility and had scheduled the toxicology analysis of the napkin for that afternoon. "We need to be proactive now," she said. "Curtis has moved this into the legal system, which means we need to treat it as a formal legal matter. I'm going to request the security footage from the banquet hall and get sworn statements from our witnesses." "How long will that take?" "A few days for the footage, maybe a week for all the statements. But Franklin, there's something else we need to discuss. Curtis is apparently talking to reporters." My stomach tightened. "What kind of reporters?" "Local news, legal journals, anyone who might be interested in a story about a corrupt Supreme Court justice. He's not just trying to win a legal battle anymore. He's trying to destroy your legacy." The next few days were a blur of legal preparation and damage control. Patricia worked with military efficiency, gathering evidence and building our defense while I tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. But the stress was taking its toll on everyone. Judith found herself fielding calls from concerned friends who had heard rumors about the police investigation. Dr. Pace stopped by to offer his support and to provide a detailed statement about Curtis's behavior at the dinner. Even some of my former colleagues from the court reached out, offering character references and expressing their disbelief at the accusations. The security footage from the banquet hall proved to be exactly what we needed. The cameras had captured Curtis's suspicious behavior around our table, including the moment when he reached across to tamper with my glass. More importantly, they showed the sequence of events that led to the glass switch, clearly demonstrating that Curtis had consumed his own trap. Valeria Russo provided a sworn statement describing Curtis's nervous behavior and confirming that she had seen him acting suspiciously near my place setting. 2 servers also came forward with statements saying they had noticed Curtis handling items on the table in an unusual manner. The toxicology report on the napkin was the final piece of evidence we needed. The analysis revealed traces of senicides, a powerful laxative compound commonly found in over-the-counter medications designed to cause rapid and urgent bowel movements. The concentration was high enough to suggest that Curtis had used a significant amount, probably hoping to cause maximum embarrassment. "This is perfect," Patricia said as she reviewed the lab results. "Not only does it prove that your glass was tampered with, but the specific substance shows clear intent to humiliate rather than seriously harm. It's exactly the kind of prank that fits with his personality and his grudge." But Curtis wasn't finished. On Thursday, a reporter from the local newspaper called my house, asking for comment on allegations of judicial misconduct and personal vendetta. Judith took the call and politely declined to comment. But the fact that Curtis had successfully gotten media attention was concerning. That evening, Patricia called with an update on the police investigation. "They've interviewed Curtis and reviewed his complaint," she said. "The detective assigned to the case is skeptical, especially after seeing the security footage and our witness statements. But Curtis is pushing hard, and he's hired a high-profile attorney to represent him." "Who?" "Richard Blackwood. He specializes in high-profile civil cases and media manipulation. This confirms that Curtis is more interested in public relations than actual justice." "What's our next move?" "We go on offense. I'm scheduling a meeting with the district attorney's office to present our evidence and request that they consider charges against Curtis for filing a false police report. I'm also preparing a defamation lawsuit in case he continues his media campaign." Friday brought an unexpected development. Curtis announced that he was holding a press conference on Monday morning to tell the truth about Justice Franklin Everett's abuse of power. The announcement was covered by local news stations and legal blogs, generating exactly the kind of public attention Curtis wanted, but it also gave us an opportunity. "He's overplaying his hand," Patricia observed as we watched the news coverage. "Press conferences are risky when you don't have solid evidence. If we can present our case effectively, his own publicity stunt will backfire." "What do you have in mind?" "We crash his press conference. We show up with our evidence, our witnesses, and our own prepared statement. We turn his moment of triumph into a public humiliation that he'll never recover from." I considered the proposal carefully. It was aggressive, risky, and completely contrary to my usual approach of measured, behind-the-scenes legal maneuvering. But Curtis had made this personal when he involved my family, and he had made it public when he went to the media. Perhaps it was time to remind him that some battles are better left unfought, and that attacking a man who had spent 30 years mastering the art of presenting evidence and destroying false narratives was not a wise strategy. "Set it up," I told Patricia, "but I want to do this right. Full documentation, multiple witnesses, and a presentation that leaves no room for doubt about what really happened." "What about the family situation? This is going to make things worse with Mallory and the grandchildren." I thought about my grandchildren, about the legacy I wanted to leave them, about the kind of man I wanted them to remember their grandfather as being. Curtis was trying to paint me as a vindictive, dangerous person who abused his power to hurt others. If I let his accusations stand unchallenged, that might become their lasting memory of me. "The family situation is already as bad as it can get," I said finally. "At least this way, they'll know the truth." Over the weekend, Patricia and I prepared for what would essentially be a public trial. We organized our evidence into a clear, compelling narrative. We confirmed that our key witnesses would be present. We prepared a detailed timeline of events that would be impossible to refute. Most importantly, we prepared for the moment when Curtis would realize that his carefully planned revenge had not only failed, but had exposed him to exactly the kind of public humiliation he had intended for me. On Sunday evening, I sat in my study and reviewed our presentation one final time. 30 years of judicial experience had taught me that the most effective arguments were built on facts, not emotions. Curtis would come to his press conference with accusations and grievances. I would come with evidence and witnesses. The irony was not lost on me. Curtis had spent 3 decades nursing a grudge over a court case where I had simply applied the law to the facts. Now he was about to experience another court case, this one conducted in the court of public opinion, where the same principle would apply. Justice, it seemed, really did have a way of finding those who tried to pervert it. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn, the kind of day that felt made for decisive action. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the same one I'd worn to important court proceedings, and reviewed my notes one last time. Patricia had arranged for us to reach Curtis's press conference just as he finished his prepared statement, giving him plenty of room to expose himself before we laid out the facts. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the downtown Marriott, in the same ballroom where Curtis had announced several major real estate developments over the years. He had chosen the location deliberately, surrounding himself with the trappings of success and legitimacy. But Patricia had done her homework on the venue as well, confirming that the room had excellent acoustics and sightlines that would work in our favor when we made our presentation. Dr. Leonard Pace called just as I was leaving the house. "Franklin, are you sure about this approach? Once you go public, there's no taking it back." "Curtis made it public when he filed false police reports and called press conferences," I replied. "I'm just correcting the record. And if it destroys your relationship with Mallory and the grandchildren permanently." I had been wrestling with that question all weekend. The truth was, my relationship with Mallory was probably already beyond repair. She had chosen to believe her father's accusations without asking for my side of the story, had threatened to keep my grandchildren away from me, and had actively participated in his campaign to destroy my reputation. At some point, you have to accept that some relationships cannot be salvaged and focus on protecting what can be saved. Then at least they'll grow up knowing the truth about what happened, I said. And maybe someday they'll understand that their grandfather wasn't the villain in this story. Patricia met me in the hotel parking lot, along with Valeria Russo and Dr. Pace, who had agreed to serve as witnesses. She had prepared packets of evidence for the reporters, complete with copies of the security footage, witness statements, and toxicology reports. Everything was organized, professional, and devastating to Curtis's narrative. "Remember," Patricia said as we walked toward the hotel entrance, "let him finish his statement completely. Don't interrupt, don't react visibly, just let him dig his own grave. Then we present our evidence calmly and systematically." The ballroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Curtis stood at a podium draped with microphones from local TV stations and newspapers, looking every inch the successful businessman seeking justice. His attorney, Richard Blackwood, stood nearby with the kind of confident posture that suggested he believed his client's version of events. Mallory sat in the front row, her face set in an expression of righteous determination. Graham was conspicuously absent, and I wondered if he had finally decided that he couldn't support his father-in-law's accusations. Several of Curtis's business associates filled out the audience, providing a show of support that was probably more about maintaining relationships than any real belief in his claims. Curtis began his statement with a brief overview of his successful career and his standing in the community. He portrayed himself as a family man who had overcome past mistakes and built a respectable business. Then he launched into his accusations against me, painting a picture of a vindictive judge who had harbored a 30-year grudge and finally found an opportunity for revenge. "Justice Franklin Everett deliberately poisoned me at his own retirement dinner," Curtis declared, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being believed. "He brought illegal substances to that event with the specific intent of humiliating me in front of my family and colleagues. This was not a random act of illness. It was a calculated attack by a man who has never forgotten that I once stood up to his abuse of power." He went on to describe his version of events from the dinner, claiming that I had acted suspiciously throughout the evening and that my clumsy dropping of the fork had been a deliberate distraction. He produced what he claimed was evidence, a receipt from a pharmacy showing the purchase of suspicious substances, though he was careful not to specify what those substances were or when they had been purchased. "For 30 years, Franklin Everett has hidden behind his judicial robes and his reputation for fairness," Curtis continued. "But I'm here today to tell you that reputation is a lie. He is a vindictive, dangerous man who uses his power and influence to destroy anyone who challenges him. What he did to me at that dinner was assault, pure and simple, and I demand that he be held accountable." The reporters scribbled notes and asked follow-up questions, most of which Curtis deflected to his attorney. Blackwood fielded the inquiries with practiced ease, promising that they would be filing both criminal and civil charges, and that they had substantial evidence to support their claims. When Curtis finished his statement and opened the floor for questions, Patricia stood up from her seat near the back of the room. "Mr. Noland, this is Patricia Westbrook, representing Justice Everett. Would you be willing to examine some additional evidence related to your accusations?" The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at us. Curtis's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then anger as he realized that we had come prepared for battle. "This is highly irregular," Blackwood interjected. "This is Mr. Noland's press conference. And these are serious accusations that deserve a complete examination of the facts," Patricia replied smoothly. "Unless Mr. Noland is afraid to have his claims scrutinized." Curtis's pride wouldn't let him back down from the challenge. "I have nothing to hide. Let's see what kind of lies they've prepared." "Thank you," Patricia said, moving toward the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you report on Mr. Noland's accusations, I think you should see all the evidence." What happened next unfolded with the methodical precision of a court proceeding, which was exactly what I had intended. Patricia began by distributing evidence packets to every reporter in the room, ensuring that they would have documentation to support our version of events. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, stepping up to the podium that Curtis had just vacated, "Mr. Noland has made some very serious accusations against me today. As someone who spent 30 years in the judicial system, I believe that accusations should be supported by evidence, not just emotion. So let's examine the facts." I could see Curtis's face growing red with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his moment of triumph was being turned against him. Mallory looked shocked, as if she hadn't considered the possibility that I might have evidence to contradict her father's story. "First, let's establish what really happened at my retirement dinner," I continued, activating a laptop that Patricia had connected to the room's projection system. "This is security footage from the Grandview Manor, showing the events that Mr. Noland has described." The video played on the large screen behind me, showing a clear view of our table throughout the evening. The timestamp in the corner tracked the progression of events, and I narrated what the cameras had captured. Here we see Mr. Noland arriving at the dinner, appearing relaxed and confident. Here he is during the cocktail hour, engaging in what appears to be an intense conversation with his daughter near the hotel bar. I paused the video at the moment when Curtis and Mallory were clearly discussing something serious, their body language suggesting conspiracy rather than casual conversation. Now we move to the dinner itself. Notice Mr. Noland's behavior during the wine service. The video showed Curtis checking his watch repeatedly, fumbling with his napkin, and then making his suspicious reach across the table. Watch his left hand carefully as he passes the salt to my wife. You'll notice that his right hand moves over my wine glass in a way that appears deliberately concealed from other diners. A murmur went through the crowd of reporters as they watched Curtis's obvious tampering with my drink. The video evidence was clear and damning, showing behavior that could only be interpreted as deliberate sabotage. "Now watch what happens next," I continued, advancing the video to show my own actions. I drop my fork, admittedly clumsy of me, and bend down to retrieve it. During this brief distraction, the wine glasses are switched. Mr. Noland then proceeds to drink from what he believes is my glass, but is actually his own. The sequence was crystal clear on the security footage. Curtis reached for his wine glass immediately after I straightened up, took a healthy sip, and then continued with his planned toast. The irony of the situation was visible to everyone in the room. "The results of Mr. Noland's consumption of his own trap are well documented," I said, advancing to the footage of Curtis's hasty and undignified exit from the podium. Whatever he had intended for me instead affected him, leading to the embarrassing scene that followed. "Oh," Curtis started to object, but I held up my hand for silence. But perhaps Mr. Noland simply made an innocent mistake. Perhaps he accidentally contaminated his own drink through some mishap. Let's examine the physical evidence. Patricia stepped forward with the toxicology report, reading the results in a clear, professional voice that carried to every corner of the room. Laboratory analysis of fabric samples taken from Justice Everett's napkin revealed the presence of senocides in significant concentration. Senocides are the active ingredient in powerful laxatives designed to cause rapid and urgent bowel movements. The concentration found suggests that a substantial amount of this substance was dissolved in the wine glass that Mr. Noland tampered with. The reporters were scribbling furiously now, and I could see several of them looking at Curtis with expressions of disbelief and disgust. The idea that a grown man would try to humiliate someone with a laxative prank was both juvenile and disturbing. "Now let's examine Mr. Noland's motives," I continued, pulling up documents from the 1994 court case. "Mr. Noland claims that I harbored a 30-year grudge against him. Let's look at the facts of our previous interaction." I displayed the case summary on the screen, showing Curtis's conviction for fraudulent building permits and bribery of city officials. The charges were clearly laid out, along with the evidence that had led to his plea agreement. Mr. Noland was found guilty of serious financial crimes that endangered public safety and corrupted city officials. He received a fine of $50,000 and 2 years probation, a sentence that his own attorneys described as more than fair, given the scope of his violations. I paused to let that sink in before continuing. The court transcript shows that Mr. Noland was not satisfied with this outcome. Upon sentencing, he stated, and I quote, "This isn't over. People like you think you can destroy people like me, but you're wrong. I have a long memory." Curtis's face had gone from red to pale as the weight of the evidence mounted against him. His attorney was frantically taking notes, probably trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a case of judicial misconduct or personal vendetta. This was a case of a man who spent 30 years nursing a grudge over a fair and appropriate sentence, and who finally saw an opportunity for revenge at my retirement dinner." I nodded to Valeria Russo, who stepped forward to give her statement. "I'm Valeria Russo, catering manager for the Grandview Manor," she began. I personally oversaw the service at Justice Everett's table that evening. I observed Mr. Noland acting in an unusual and suspicious manner around the place settings, particularly near Justice Everett's wine glass. His behavior was so odd that I made a note to watch him more carefully, which is why I was able to confirm the sequence of events shown in the security footage. Dr. Pace followed with his own observations, describing Curtis's nervous behavior throughout the evening and his obvious anticipation of some kind of confrontation. 2 other witnesses provided similar statements, painting a picture of a man who had come to the dinner with a specific plan for revenge. By the time we finished presenting our evidence, the room had fallen completely silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters and the scratching of pens on paper. Curtis sat in his chair looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse around him. "Mr. Noland," I said, turning to face him directly, "you came here today to accuse me of assault and misconduct. But the evidence clearly shows that you are the one who brought illegal substances to my retirement dinner with the intent to humiliate me publicly. You are the one who tampered with drinks, who planned a malicious prank, who filed false police reports when your scheme backfired." Curtis tried to stand, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. You can't prove?" "I just did," I replied calmly. "In front of witnesses, with documentation, and with video evidence that will be available to law enforcement and the media. The question now is whether you want to compound your problems by continuing to make false accusations, or whether you're ready to accept responsibility for your actions." The reporters began shouting questions at Curtis, but he was beyond answering coherently. His carefully planned press conference had become a public exposure of his own criminal behavior, and everyone in the room could see that he had been caught red-handed. Mallory sat frozen in her chair, her face a study in shock and dawning comprehension. For the first time, she was seeing her father not as a victim of judicial misconduct, but as a vindictive man who had tried to destroy someone's reputation with lies and dirty tricks. "One final point," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the chaos. "Mr. Noland has threatened to sue me for damages related to his illness at the dinner. I want to make it clear that any such lawsuit will be met with countercharges for defamation, harassment, filing false police reports, and attempted assault. The evidence you've seen today will be turned over to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for prosecution." Curtis's attorney was pulling him toward the exit, probably realizing that every additional moment in front of the cameras was making things worse for his client. But Curtis couldn't resist one final outburst. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage and desperation. "I'll destroy you. His words were cut off as Blackwood physically dragged him from the room, leaving behind an audience of reporters who had just witnessed one of the most spectacular self-destructions in recent memory. As the crowd began to disperse, I gathered my materials and prepared to leave. The battle was over, and Curtis's reputation lay in ruins around him. His threats of lawsuits and criminal charges had been exposed as the desperate bluster of a man caught in his own trap. Mallory approached me as I was packing up my laptop, her face streaked with tears of humiliation and regret. "Franklin, I didn't know—" "Yes, you did," I replied quietly. "You chose to believe your father's accusations without asking for my side of the story. You threatened to keep my grandchildren away from me based on lies and revenge fantasies. You participated in his campaign to destroy my reputation. But you thought what you wanted to think, just like your father." I walked past her toward the exit, where Judith was waiting with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The truth had been told, a justice had been served, and Curtis Noland had learned the same lesson his younger self had learned 30 years ago. Some battles are better left unfought, and attacking someone who understands the law better than you do is rarely a wise strategy. As we left the hotel, I could hear the reporters already calling their editors with the story of how a man's attempt at revenge had backfired so spectacularly that he had destroyed himself in front of the entire local media. By evening, Curtis's humiliation would be the lead story on every local news station, and by tomorrow it would be spreading through legal blogs and social media. His reputation, which he had spent 30 years rebuilding after his original conviction, was now permanently destroyed. His threats and accusations had been exposed as lies. His own daughter had witnessed his complete humiliation in front of dozens of witnesses.